Hello and welcome to B2G Sales and Marketing SLED Fundamentals. Thank you for joining our program. My name is John McKenzie. I'll be your instructor today and through the majority of the program. I've spent the last 14 years selling into SLED and consulting with SLED clients, and I've had the fortune of working across the market. We designed this course to specifically teach you things about SLED that you will not find anywhere else. And we've also built this program so that you'll come away with the knowledge and the insight you need to create proactive B2G sales and marketing campaigns. This course is not designed to help you search for RFPs and respond. This course is designed to help you create opportunities and lead the discussion with SLED clients. If you are in sales, you will come away from this course with insights that will help you close more deals and make more money. If you're part of a marketing team, you're going to understand what type of content will resonate with government buyers and how to reach them. And if you're part of a founding team that's just looking to break into SLED, we're going to show you a proven strategy that will help you break into the market without breaking the bank. Today's lesson, SLED 101, sets the stage for the rest of the program. We're going to teach you the types of governments that make up the market, give you a view of the overall size and scope of this massive market that's out there. Going to teach you some differences between the market segments and some key similarities, and then give you some core principles for selling into the SLED market. So let's start out by just taking a quick look at how money flows through government. This is an important thing to consider when you're thinking of doing work at any level of government, just to understand how the money moves through what can be a rather bureaucratic system here. So if you look at this pyramid we have here, at the bottom of the pyramid, you have your residents, your citizens. They're paying tax dollars. Pay taxes to the federal government, state government, and to local governments as well. It's a lot of money. So, annually, the federal government spends about $3.4 trillion, and $1.2 trillion of that money is spent or passed down to the states. The states annually spend $3.6 trillion. They directly spend, so purchasing products, services, $1.7 trillion. And then they further pass $571 billion down to local governments, your counties, your cities and towns. And they collectively spend about $1.8 trillion directly. So altogether, the SLED market is big. It's very big. It's $3.5 trillion that are being spent on an annual basis by within the SLED market. What makes it so tricky is that $3.5 trillion is spread across over 92,000 different government entities. So there's a lot to sort through there. Let's start breaking down SLED sort of letter by letter. Everybody knows we have states, right? Everybody knows we have 50 states. However, that's actually not the right number when we're talking about the SLED market. We really mean 55, and that's because we have 5 U.S. territories who, from a business perspective, act just like they would a state. So when we say state, the state market, and the S in SLED, we're really referring to all 50 states plus the 5 U.S. territories. So Puerto Rico, Guam, American Samoa, couple more I don't feel like listing on geography quiz here. Again, that 55 number, it's not really correct when you're thinking about buyers. How many buyers? What does this actual market look like? And that's because you rarely sell to the individual state. You typically are going to be selling and working with one of the various state agencies. And these can be things like departments, divisions, commissions, boards. There are a lot of them. So the state of Florida, where I live and where my company is based, we have 111 different state agencies. So 111 departments, divisions, boards, and commissions. California has 237. If you move over to Wyoming, which is our least populated and most conservative state, They have 48. There's still that number, that 55, you really need to multiply it by about 50 to come up with a more reasonable number for the state market in terms of number of entities to potentially sell to. But let's move into local. So there are a lot of local governments in the United States, 78,029 to be exact. And those fall into two separate buckets. You have general governments, and there are roughly 39,000 of those, and special governments. And there are also roughly 39,000 special governments. Now, general governments, things you think of as cities, counties, towns, villages, generally places where people live. While special governments are very specialized. They're providing a specific service for a specific area. So these are things like utility districts, hospital districts, irrigation districts, transportation districts. There are a lot of special districts. There are many, many, many different types of special districts. Now, let's take a look at a fake map here. It really helps to emphasize an important point about the SLED market. So the public sector, specifically local government here, is really intrinsically tied to location, really more so than any other market out there, the possible exception of real estate. So if you're looking at counties are always contiguous. And by that, I mean, if you're in the United States, you're in one county and move outside that county, you will enter another county. Same with states, right? As long as they're located within the contiguous United States, then you will always move from one to the other, and those will be contiguous. Now, that's not the case with cities, towns, and villages, your local governments here. Those are often not contiguous. Sometimes they can be. I'm from the Boston area originally, and pretty much all of New England, the cities, towns, and villages are contiguous. But that's relatively rare. It's not something you're going to see in lots of other places. Around major metropolitan areas, you do see that pretty frequently. But when you get to more rural areas, more sparsely populated areas, you will see less contiguous or less contiguity with the cities, towns, and villages. But they are contained within a county. There are cases where a municipality might be in more than one county, but that's relatively rare. So then we have special districts. Special districts are typically going to be picking up a service that residents need, but is not provided by either the county or the city or town or village that they live in. And so special districts will have different borders than the county or the local governments, the cities and the towns. And it's important to note that the special districts don't always fall completely within a county. They can be larger than that. They can be smaller than that. They could, in fact, share boundaries with the county. It does depend quite a bit. The important thing to note is that they specialize in providing a service that the other governments in that area do not provide. Now, let's look at education. So there's almost 14,000 education agencies out there in the United States, public education, I should say. And the majority of those are what we think of as K through 12 independent school districts. And that's generally what people are thinking of when we talk about the ed in education. However, it's important to know that there's also community colleges, community college districts. There's also big public state universities, all fall into this ed category. And now if you're talking about those community college districts or the K through 12 education districts, you can see they also fall into an area on the map here where they're serving the same residents as the people who live in the cities and the counties and the special districts. Now, the reason I put all of this on a map is, and it'll start to become clear as I move along in this presentation, but the point is that these agencies, although they are doing different things, they are all providing what are really essential services to the same people. So their customers are residents. Their customers are all the same, even if they do something very different. So the water utility is providing services to the same people who are sending their children to the school district. And that's an important thing to know when you're working in the SLED market. All right. So let me talk about what is different amongst all of these. There are a few key differences that it's important just to know. I mean, you probably do know, but it's just important to call out. So this is from my experience working with cities. This is the largest local government that I've worked with was the County of San Diego. I am discounting state agencies, and honestly, I think the County of San Diego is bigger than any of the state agencies I've worked with. But there's 3.3 million people in the County of San Diego. They've got 21,351 employees, and their 23-24 budget was $8.17 billion. Enormous, right? And they do everything. Huge. And then you have a city like Langley, Washington, which is not the smallest city I've worked with, but I put them here for a reason. And one is that they are very small, right? They've got 11 employees and a total population of 1,148 people. But their annual budget of $13.4 million is actually, that's pretty high for a government with just 11 employees and 1,148 people. And it illustrates a point that I think is important, specifically with cities and the local government clients, which is that Langley, Washington is beautiful. It is a tourist place. It's out, is it on, I forget which island. It's on one of the islands in Washington overlooking Puget Sound. It's a bit of a tourist hub. And so the population that lives there doesn't, like, if you look at that size, it does not represent what happens in that city. It does not represent what they're willing to spend on. You can't make that generalization because they have a unique situation in that their population may be 1,148, but they've probably got 20,000 people in their city every day because people go there on vacation. They go there and there's more economic activity. There are stores. There's more tax dollars coming in. So even though they have this small population, they have a much larger footprint as a potential buyer. And that's something that will come up time and time again when you're looking at cities and towns across the U.S. You've got to it's important to sort of understand why they're different in certain areas and what those differences can mean. Services. All right. The difference in services that are provided in the SLED market is just like mind-boggling when you think about it. And so you have everything from emergency services to irrigation that's provided for farming, parks, recycling, transportation, teaching, electricity, utilities. It's a massive difference all over the place. And that can get very confusing. But it's also important to know just that there are these differences, and you're going to see like the way a mosquito control district operates is going to be different than your metropolitan transportation agency. And you need to know that going in, but you also don't want to get caught up in it. So it's important to recognize there are these differences and not just like put a veil over and pretend they don't exist. You have to know they exist, but you don't want to get caught up into it. Regulations. So this may be political science 101 for folks, but I think it's important just to illustrate here. The regulations do differ from place to place. And this can I think this is where probably most people get tripped up looking at this market. So, furthest to the left here, you have the federal government. The federal government's laws are applicable to everybody, right? So they're applicable to, I just randomly chose 4 states here, right? They're applicable to everybody and every business and every city within New York State, Washington State, South Carolina, West Virginia, every other state. But those cities at the local government level, they have to comply with federal law, but they also have to comply with state law. So a city in New York is going to comply with New York State's law and the federal laws, and those might be a little bit different than, say, the laws in Washington State and the federal laws. They'll both comply with the federal law, but their state laws may be different. And then it gets even more confusing because the local governments have their own rules and regulations. You have city charters and things like that, and those can have very specific guidelines and things they need to follow. So you reach this point where you can have vastly different sets of rules and regulations that they're all following. All following their own. They're different from place to place. And it can be very hard when you take this national level look if you start looking at all these individual laws. There's way too many. Nobody's going to know it. Nobody can know it, right? There's just far too many. Nobody expects you to know it. So it's important to be aware that this exists, that this is how it works. You need to know this is the reality, but what you don't need to know are the particulars, the specifics of each of these differences. So what you do to get around this sort of tangled mess is know that these things are different, know that they happen, that there are these differences, but focus on what is the same. And so we're going to go back to this slide, which is what's the same? They all get their revenue the same way, right? Primarily from taxes. There are grants and funds and things are distributed and so forth. But the reality is cities, counties, school districts, anybody in this, any type of client in this sector, their revenue comes from you and me and people paying taxes. And the result of how that money flows through them, how they generate their revenue, trickles down throughout everything, right? Think of any other business. Everything starts with how you make your money, right? How the business operates, it all rolls back to how they make their money. And so in this case, state and local education, they all make their money by people paying taxes, something people have to do. They're required to do. You get in trouble if you do not do it. And a result of that means that they all spend things similar, right? They're going to spend their money, their revenues in different ways and on different things, but they're all going to follow the same or somewhat, they're going to follow similar processes in how they spend that money. So a few of the things that will always be the same is that there will be a process, right? You may not know what the specific process is, and it may differ from place to place, but there will be a process. There will be things you need to do at specific times in order to get money. All right. Like there will be something that it will be rigid, right? There are deadlines you can't miss. There are going to be these rules. You don't need to know what each of those are, but you need to know that they're going to have them. So you better ask if you're talking to a client, what do you need to do? The client will be fine if you don't know the specifics of their town charter and don't know what day you need to have something available for their city council agenda. That's fine. But the fact that you can ask that question and understand that there are rules and regulations that are going to be very specific to this client that we need to know in order to make this sale go through, that will be important. So this program, and I'll say this over and over again, it's about learning what you don't know in this industry, right? Because you can't know everything, too many differences, but you can start to learn the right questions to ask. The other piece, the reason there's a magnifying glass over this process is that it's transparent. Almost always the government buying process will be transparent, and that will have an impact on what you do. It will have an impact on how you sell. It will have an impact on how they buy. And it's important to keep in mind, this stuff is not behind closed doors. At the very least, anybody can request information and get it. In a lot of places, it's just out there, right? You have a contract that's going to be, anybody can go and download it and see the document. The structure. All of these organizations are structured similarly. So you have the people down the bottom here, and they elect a board. Think if we sort of relate this to the private sector, you have like a board and they're, I guess, elected by stockholders or something. But in this case, all the people are the residents are the taxpayers. They are the folks who elect a council or a board or a commission, and they are sort of an oversight committee, if you will. They may give directives on initiatives and things like that. But the reality is that most of these organizations are run by people right below that who are being overseen by this elected group. And that's, with cities, it's often your city manager. It could be a strong mayor, depending on the form of government, which is a little bit of doesn't quite fit with this diagram, but that's all right. But it could be oftentimes a superintendent if we're talking about a school district, even state agencies, right? You have department heads or agency heads who would sort of serve as that person at the top sort of running the show. But this structure where there's an elected board overseeing a manager, an administrator, or it could be a county, and then having department heads and then staff. It's the same throughout. And again, the fact that this is the same means that certain procedures and processes and decisions are going to be made following that same structure. So it's important to know. And it doesn't matter if you're in a tiny little rural town in Eastern Washington or if you're at the county of San Diego. That sort of org chart is going to be very, very similar. One may be much larger than another, but the procedures and the process and sign-offs that have to happen in order for a purchase to take place are going to be very similar. Regulations. I just said how different the regulations can be. So, and that's true. That's very much true. But the spirit of the regulations are almost always the same, right? There may be more or less in certain places, and they may take somewhat different forms from one place to another, but they do have the same spirit. They're really all trying to do the same thing. They want to make efficient use of taxpayer dollars. They're generally trying to promote fairness and transparency and increase market competition, which gets back to making efficient use of taxpayer dollars. These are all going to be sort of at heart of many of the regulations you have to go through. Some of them maybe feel a little bit more bureaucratic than need to be. That's not the case all the time, but sometimes that is part of the reality of dealing with the public sector. But it's important to know, why are these things here? It's because of the spirit of the regulations are to promote these things, which, hey, I'm okay with. I'm more than happy to have my tax dollars used efficiently and there to be more competition in the market and have transparency into the processes of how the people who are spending my dollars are using it, and have fairness in the whole process. That's at the spirit of all these regulations. And again, just something that's important to keep in mind as you are doing working in this sector. What's the same? Culture. Obviously, the culture can be very different, right? You can have like a borough in New York versus, a rural area of Arizona or something. Very, very different cultures amongst the people who are living there, perhaps, but not so much amongst the people working in their county administration or their city administration. There's a culture of collaboration at each of these. And what I mean by that is a city and the county are not competitors in the sense that, say, Coke and Pepsi are competitors. There's no trade secrets. They may not necessarily like each other in some places, and they might be competing over funds at some times, but the reality is they know each other, they talk to each other, and they collaborate. Sometimes it's forced, sometimes it's not. So it's not a typical competitive market with your clients aren't competing against one another. They're collaborating with one another. And that's something that can be incredibly powerful if you take advantage of it. The fact that you can have a great client and they don't want to make you sign an NDA and prevent anybody else from knowing that you're doing great work for them. They want to go and talk to all of their neighbors and all of your other potential clients. They even have an incentive to go out and tell your other potential clients how well you're doing. They're risk averse generally. It gets back to these are taxpayer dollars. And I have heard on several occasions talking with people working at a city or community college or wherever that they are personally thinking and personally taking responsibility for the fact that the money that they are spending came from their residents' pockets, right? That it's not just something they don't like. Sometimes I pay my taxes. I don't really think about it. That's kind of the case. I'm sure this happens that sometimes that's the case and people don't really think about it, but I have encountered it a number of times that people have called out and said, these are my residents, these people, these are my neighbors. This is their money, right? This is their money. I want to be careful with it. So they are risk averse, and that can be challenging. But if you know that's the case, you can figure out how to address that. You understand that they're likely to be risk averse. How can you de-risk things for them, right? That's something you're going to want to think about. And then altruistic. Again, that gets back to what I was just saying about people wanting to be careful with their neighbor's money. nobody goes into working for a city or a county for money. That would be a really bad decision. Like, that's not good financial advice, going into global government to make money. Nobody does it. There's a general sense of altruism that you will find that's common across local government employees. So with that, I want to leave you with some really key takeaways, key things that I'd encourage you to keep in mind as we go through this. And the first one is that everything you do in this sector, every communication you have with a client, the potential client, every contract you sign, all of the work that you do is public. And that can be incredibly powerful if you use it to your advantage. It can be incredibly problematic if you're careless about the fact that everything is public. When I say use it to your advantage, what I mean is that, if I'm selling something in the retail space and I'm trying to figure out, what my competitor is charging, that would be hard for me to do. But in the public space, I can go and find every single contract my competitor has out there, and I can see exactly what they're charging. Oftentimes, you can see exactly what their proposal is. Almost all the time, I can see how they're proposing things. I can figure out exactly what things they do well, what they don't do well. It's all there. It can be challenging to do all that research to find things, but if you take advantage of the fact that everything is out there, and you put more hustle in than your competitors by doing that research, you're going to win. There's, everybody here is smart, right? Like, you can take advantage of the information that's out there, and it's all out there, unlike what you see in the private sector. Tying into that is the collaboration and not competition. So, I mentioned they have this culture of collaboration, and I've mentioned that city employees and county employees, they want to make efficient use of taxpayer dollars. Taxpayers rarely know the specifics of how efficient a certain project was, right? Why would you, right? We're busy. People have lives. You're on calls like this. You're taking your kids to school, picking them up, taking them to baseball practice, that sort of thing. You don't, and so the government work can be thankless in a sense, right? You turn on your water, that's because you paid your taxes, right? Like, for the most part, unless you have a well or something. And so what I'm trying to get at here is that cities, clients that you have in the local government market and the SLED market are incentivized to show how they use your tax dollars. Right? There is an incentive and a desire for them to do that. You can absolutely use that to your advantage and have your cities and your towns market for you. How many people driving down the road have seen a sign that's like, your tax dollars at work, and then it explains the project? Everybody, right? And that's paid for by them. They're paying, the whatever construction company's getting some free marketing there, and they are paying to do that. And the reason is people want to see that their tax dollars are being well spent. And you better believe that the city manager and the city council and all other folks want to get the message out that they are doing good work with the dollars. And so if your project's part of that good work, they're going to promote it for you. And then if you entice them a little bit to promote it, they'll jump all over. It is good business for them to promote the good business that you do. And they collaborate. They tell each other. They talk to each other. They say, hey, I just did work with Ross, and we installed a whole bunch of his EV chargers, and it's working great. And we're in Somerville, Mass. And hey, look, we're getting a phone call from, I don't know, Cambridge or something, and very similar places. And hey, here we go. You should use it here. It's working out here. That happens all the time in local government work. Doesn't happen in the private sector, generally speaking. You don't need to know everything. I think I've probably said that a bunch, right? You do not need to know everything. You can't know everything. But if you come in, you don't want to, it's an important place to be humble, because what I think can happen is you can know the sector well enough and be comfortable enough that you can make mistakes thinking you understand how something's going to operate. And what's important is not necessarily knowing all the ins and outs, but also knowing where to ask questions. And I'll give you an example here. I worked with this city. I think I mentioned this example to you before, but this one, it's easy to call out because it's sort of very specific. But I did work with city of Tacoma Park, Maryland. And I did work on redistricting their city council boundaries. And city council, the redistricting is regulated federally and at the state and so forth. There are all these different rules. I knew most of them. I did a ton of work in this area. I knew most of them. And then we get to Tacoma Park, Maryland, which is the only city in the country that had a vote that allowed people 16 or over to vote in local elections. That causes all sorts of other ripple effects in terms of local government redistricting. And it's not something you would necessarily, I mean, honestly, I guess I could have known that. It was in the papers and stuff like that. But it's something that's so specific that if I went in there thinking I know everything about redistricting, I would screw that up because it's so specific to that city. But what's helpful is to know to ask the question. And the question could be as simple as, hey, you got any weird things in your town charter? I mean, what are the sort of atypical things in your charter that I should be aware of in this process? And your client's going to be thrilled that you asked that, because it's showing that you, one, have the knowledge you're knowledgeable enough to know that cities can have weird things. You go up around New England, Massachusetts, it's like, oh, we got to comply with this rule that's on the books from 1748. And for some reason, it's still being enforced, and they will appreciate that you know to ask that question, and they would never expect you to know the answer. And so you don't need to know everything, but throughout this program, I will encourage you to try to get a sense of the right questions to ask, when to ask them, and who to ask them to. And that leads me to the last point, which is learn to ask the right questions, right? That's the biggest takeaway. You will show that you know this market by asking questions, not by knowing the answers, right? You are not a lawyer. The only person who knows all of the city's rules and regulations, or all of the county's specific rules and regulations, is their attorney. That's it. Nobody else. That's why they employ an attorney. That's their job. Everybody goes to the attorney, right? These are long documents. They're developed over hundreds of years. They're iterated on. There's just too much. You can't know everything. It's okay. You shouldn't know everything. You shouldn't try to know everything, but you can strive to ask the right questions.